Welcome to Current Affairs Taiwan. Mike, what have we got up on the show today?
Well, today we've got Donovan talking about quarantine. And at the end of the show, we'll return to that with its broader implications for society as a whole. We've got the Taiwan People's Party attacking the head of the COVID-19 response. We've got the KMT pushing for the 18-year-olds to vote and 20-year-olds to run for office in a move that makes me think I've awakened on an alternate timeline. And we've got Sz-Huai with another appearance on our show today. And we've got adultery. Okay, we don't have adultery, but we're going to talk about it. And the WHO, which has just treated Taiwan like the redheaded stepchild. And finally, some news about the news outlets kicked out of the PRC. Hopefully, they'll be coming here. So stick around. It's going to be a good show. Hello out there. Welcome back to another episode of Current Affairs Taiwan. I'm Michael Turton, and that voice from the other world is Donovan Smith. Here now with an announcement.
All right. So, unfortunately, our sponsor, May Jam, has suspended May Jam this year and will continue with it, of course, next year. It's closed due to the coronavirus, like pretty much everything right now, which is a big disappointment. But, of course, safety is important. Be sure to stay up to date on May Jam at mayjam.com.
All right.
So, what do we have on the show today, Mike?
What do we have on the show? We have you, sir. You are the star today, because I'm going to ask you what happened to you 3 weeks ago or a month ago or whenever it was. You had an encounter with Mr. Coronavirus.
That's right. Patient 50. We can talk about it now.
Okay.
So the story starts a couple of weeks ago. Maybe over 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, it's a long time ago now. Almost, yeah. Go ahead.
Well, my quarantine ended a week ago.
Okay.
So I guess 2.5 weeks ago. Basically, my business partner at Compass, he was hospitalized, and he got in touch with me and our Chinese editor saying, hey, I'm in the hospital. It didn't sound at the time, now he seemed to be okay, just sick, not, at death's door or anything like that. He wasn't on a ventilator, and, he had, visitors and stuff like that. And they weren't treating him like he was a COVID-19 patient. And so, they let him have visitors. They weren't, handling with hazmat suits or anything like that. But after a few days, they said, well, let's give you a test. And the initial tests came out as inconclusive. And then finally, a third test came back that he was positive. And so he messaged me, and Yuvia, I got in touch with the staff to let them know. And I'd had a meeting with them, preparing them just in case. And so I immediately ran out and, put my mask on and, try to keep as far away from everybody as possible. And I went out and did a whole bunch of shopping, including lots of toilet paper. And, of course.
So wait a second.
That seems to be the theme of the era.
He was actually tested 3 times, and the third time finally came up positive?
Well, the first one was inconclusive. I don't know what the second one was, but the third, I know that definitely the third one was conclusive.
Okay.
So our whole company was put into quarantine. And this was kind of a concern, because there's a lot of stigmatism around being quarantined and fear.
Right.
And I'm not really worried about the stigma personally, but we were afraid the press would get a hold of this, because the 2 companies up to this point that had been completely shut down and quarantined made the news. And in fact, I talked about them on ICRT. And we didn't want our staff to be stigmatized by this.
Sure. So
Doug and I made the decision we were going to do everything we could to just keep it quiet until everyone was out of quarantine and Doug was out of the hospital. So that's the case now. Doug's out of the hospital. He's fine. According to the doctors, he recovered unusually quickly. So that's very good news. But he's writing an article for the Taipei Times, so I'll let him tell his story there. I'm writing an article for Ketagalan Media, which hopefully will be out over the next couple of days. I'm nearly done with that article. So, but long story short, it was a little bit weird because I let the building administrator know in advance, so there was no fear, no panic. And the health department calls me up as expected, and they call me downstairs to the front door of the apartment building. So
in the lobby. You're going to have this conversation in the lobby, a potentially infectious person.
Right out front of the lobby, in the street.
Okay, in the street's a little better.
Right. So the woman from the health department, she was lovely. She was very polite and all that. But there's also a cop stationed there. So essentially you get a pack of stuff. You have a thermometer, and they give you a cell phone. And the cell phone, you're supposed to either call them or line them twice a day with your temperature and let them know if you have any symptoms changes. The rules are you cannot leave your home for any reason at all, unless I presume for health reasons and they take you to the hospital. But now the thing is there's obviously somebody from the government there and a cop. So the building manager comes out and says, what's going on? Now, the good news is I'd given him a heads up that this might happen. But the lady from the health department says, I'm afraid I can't tell you what's going on. This is, a legal requirement. But of course, they show up with a cop and a government person. They're handing you stuff and signing papers and all this. Not exactly subtle.
Out in the street in front of everyone. Yeah. Hey, foreigner, how about some COVID-19 stigma?
Yay. Yeah, I know. So I said, go ahead, tell him. Because, again, I wanted to sort of be transparent with him so that there was no panic. And because I knew what she would say. And she told him that basically, I'm not a suspected carrier at this point. This is just a precaution, And so I let him copy the paper that I signed, which had my release date on it. So they, again, I was trying to be very, very clear here. So there's no panic, So I'm thinking that I'm going to be spending. I go upstairs. I think I'm going to be spending the next 8 days because there was a few days gap between when he was diagnosed and the last time I'd seen him. So I didn't have a full 14-day quarantine, just an 8-day quarantine. So I'm thinking I'm not going to see any human being for 8 days. Turns out I was wrong. I had plenty of human interaction. So on day 2, this is this is my first full day of quarantine. And I'm sitting around, I'm in my boxers and working and
nobody needs that detail, okay?
Well, okay. So anyway, so my doorbell rings, not the little monitor from the front desk, my actual doorbell. So I poke my head around the door, and there's cops there, and the building manager. I'm like, what the heck? So anyway, I tell them to wait a second, pull on my pants, and they say, go get your phone. So I go get the phone that they'd left with me. They took a picture of me with the phone, and they took down my ID number. And of course, they're standing as far away as humanly possible. It's two nervous-looking young cops.
Of course.
And, they were polite and everything, but, I was like, what the heck is going on here? So I figured, this was my guess at the time, that they were coming to sort of show that the police were paying attention and, just sort of underlie the message or something. That was my guess. Well, it turns out I was wrong. Later that day, my doorbell rings again. This time it's an older cop. And I've now been, and I get a nasty message on my phone saying, you have broken quarantine. Go home now. And it's a really kind of a scary message.
Sure. But you were home when you got it. You had never left. Home.
Right. I'd never left. And so I'm freaking out, and I call the woman from the health department, who is super helpful. But she explains this is probably a signal problem. And this is when I realized that they were tracking my cell phone, my personal cell phone. not just the one that they'd left with me.
So
my
they didn't
personal
give
cell
you
phone.
they didn't give you an app or anything to put on your phone. They
No.
were just tracking it. So they went down to the local headquarters of Sz-Huai Telecom and said, "We're going to track this phone,"
Right. Which I didn't even know was legal.
which
Now,
you didn't
turns
even
out-
know either.
No. And at this point, I'd never seen any reporting saying that they were doing this.
Wow.
So that was creepy. And so the cop says, your signal showed that you'd broken quarantine. And he said that's probably a signal problem. So this really kind of changed the tone of the quarantine, because originally I was perfectly happy to go along with it. It's, but this made it really feel kind of more oppressive and kind of creepy.
Sure.
But so I actually later looked at my cell phone GPS, on Google Maps, and you could actually see it kind of roaming around the neighborhood. Sometimes it even had me in the police station. It was really weird. So now I read an article somewhere that said that people in crowded buildings, sometimes the signal doesn't fix right because there's a lot of phones.
Right.
But they showed up a bunch of times, including once at just after 6:30 in the morning, waking me up. So that kind of changed my mood.
Yeah, I remember you and I communicating about that.
Yeah.
That was pretty scary.
Yeah. So anyway, that was my experience.
Yeah, that was part of the reason I texted you every day and asked if you were okay and chatted with you.
Yeah. No, I appreciated that.
Yeah, I knew you needed that support.
Yeah,
But,
appreciated it.
Well, what else did you learn? 8 days of introspection.
Well, I was reminded that I really look terrible with a beard. One weird thing about it was after the police started showing up, my mood changed. And I felt oddly not wanting to work. I did work, but I didn't get anywhere near as much as I thought I'd get done, because I felt it was just a weird mood.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to explain.
It brings out the contrarian in you, I think. When the police show up at your door and you're just like, what?
Yeah.
Yeah. You just want
the thing is, and they could show up at any time. So it's like, you're in the shower. They're going to come show up when I'm in the shower. They did show up when I was asleep,
Wow.
So, yeah. So.
Well,
Anyway, I'm writing an article on for Ketagalan Media, which people can read. And it goes into a little bit more detail, but those are sort of the headline bits to the piece.
Well, speaking of sleeping in showers, the Constitutional Court, I hear, is going to make some changes to the adultery law.
Yeah, well, they're hearing debates on it.
Okay, what are the potentials here? What could happen?
Presumably, it could be overturned.
And if it's overturned, that would mean that it's no longer illegal to sleep outside your marriage. It would become a civil matter.
Yeah, right now it's a criminal offense.
Right. And apparently, as anyone who's lived here for any length of time knows, you have to be caught in the act. There has to be like irrefutable evidence, used condoms, photographs of you having sex, whatever. And so a lot of times it's almost impossible to arrange that. So the law isn't applied. And then it mostly, because women depend on men financially, they drop a lot of the cases more so than men do against their own husbands, although they often go after the woman if in that kind of situation, the other woman.
Yep.
Yeah. So it's been a law that a lot of women's groups have objected to, but also a lot have supported, because at least it gives the woman leverage to use against her husband who's cheating on her. So yeah. There's a lot of conservatism here that people want to keep this law because women can benefit from it.
There's the evilest part. Just quickly to throw in a few details. You can the strictest penalty is up to a year in prison. People often use it for and there's a whole industry here, and you sometimes see these billboards, and it has a monkey, usually in a suit, tiptoeing, holding a pair of shoes. I'm sure you've seen these ads around.
Really?
And of course it's a reference to a Taiwanese term, which is catch monkeys, which means to catch people in the act of having sex.
Oh.
And so there's this whole industry here of private detectives for just this purpose. And they also have branches in China, because there's a lot of Taiwanese men who are in China doing business and have mistresses there.
Oh, yeah. They have entire second marriages and second families there. I've had several of my students over the years have come to me with this, hey, I just discovered that I've got a whole set of half siblings in China because my father has a second wife there.
Yeah.
And then every time people want to tell me how great Taiwanese businessmen are, I just think of all the money they blew on mistresses and wives, during the Chen Shui-bian years, the heyday of Taiwan business there. It's just, and meanwhile, they're neglecting their women here.
Mm-hmm.
So I wrote on this a few times on the blog, but it's always been, it's a severe problem that one of the victims of men moving to China was a lot of women in working class marriages in Taiwan whose husbands just left them behind, and didn't toss them any money either. So
we should probably mention the most evil, just deeply evil part of, or one of the probably unintended consequences of the law.
Which is?
And that is that if someone is raped by a married person, and they report it to the police, that person who has been raped can be countersued for adultery.
Dear Lord, it's like wow, it's like Sharia law.
It's really creepy.
Yeah, it is.
Because
has that actually happened that you know?
Oh yeah. Do you remember there was that writer who killed herself some time ago?
Sanmao in the 90s?
No.
I know the case you're talking about. Yeah.
And she wrote a book about a girl being raped, and when she was 13 or something. That story, and now after she committed suicide, her family confirmed that, well, the story wasn't completely directly exactly the same, but it was based on something that had happened to her when she was, I think, 15 or 16. She'd been raped by her Bushiban teacher. And so what had happened after that, anyway, so she wrote about it, and her family decided not to press charges or do anything about it, precisely because they were afraid that she would be countersued, and she was, I think, 16 at the time. They didn't want her to potentially risk being put in jail for a year. Yeah,
or have to pay thousands and thousands of NT.
Yeah.
Wow, that's just crazy.
And then there was another weird side effect of that particular, the suicide case, is that after that, the government started talking about putting in all some checks on foreign teachers.
Oh, of course.
To check criminal records on foreign teachers, even though the rapist was not a foreigner.
Of course.
And they weren't going to apply it to Taiwanese Bushiban teachers, just foreign ones. So
it's so typical.
Yeah. So I for one, I strongly support this law being thrown out.
So do I.
It's just evil.
Yep. There must be other ways to make sure that the injured party in the case gets just compensation without making this kind of fallout occur.
Yeah, very few countries now have it as a criminal thing. It's not criminal in most countries,
right?
Except, well, some countries that can stone you to death. But
that's legal in some U.S. states now that you can get marijuana. Oh, never mind. But so to move on here,
I'm hoping Sean cuts in here Bob Dylan. But anyway,
so the KMT. Speaking of our constitutional, speaking of legal changes, the KMT is now pushing. Can you believe this? The KMT is now pushing to allow 18-year-olds to vote and 20-year-olds to run for office.
They're taking the lead.
That's amazing, because are there any 20-year-olds in the KMT?
Yeah, I know.
18-year-olds to vote. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, the DPP has supported this for a long time.
Right.
The TPP has come out and said they support it. The NPP has come out and said they support it. Basically, all the parties have come out and said they support it. But it's the KMT that's taking the lead and creating the legislation and everything to push the ball forward. And they're hoping that now it has some fairly high hurdles because it's changing the Constitution.
Sure.
So they have to get it through a very high majority of the legislature, but it probably will since all the parties are supporting it.
Right.
And then it has to go to the public, and then it has to pass in a public vote.
Well, that might be interesting. Does it have to pass with just a straight majority and as a referendum?
If memory serves, it's a majority, but at least a quarter of the electorate has to turn out. It's something
right.
Along those
Yeah.
lines.
I remember this because they set up these birdcage laws to prevent constitutional change after they made that whole swath of changes under Lee Teng-Hui and in the early Chen Shui-bian years. I think after they got rid of that National Assembly was when they tried to lock that down to make the process more difficult.
Yeah.
Or maybe it was after they, that quote, reform, unquote, of the legislature when they reduced the number of legislators and made it first past the post. Yeah.
That, my memory is more that it was then, but it could have been both, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Because around both times they were making a lot of changes.
So, speaking of the KMT, there was news about the amazing Sz-Huai this week.
Mm-hmm.
What happened?
Well, this is very interesting because, Sz-Huai, he's been saying a lot of things that create a lot of controversy.
Right.
And so basically, now just for listeners and viewers who are not familiar with him, just to catch you up a little bit, this is the guy that there's the party list, and this is during the election for the legislature, a certain number of legislative seats are set aside for they're allocated as a percentage of the vote they get on the party list vote. So these are people that then the party nominates and then they can allocate into the legislature. They're not directly elected. So Wu Duanyi, the previous KMT chair, chose as number 4 on the list, which is almost certain to get in, this retired general, Wu Sz-Huai, who's famous for doing things like going to China, listening to a speech given by Xi Jinping at a memorial activity for Sun Yat-sen, and then standing to the PRC national anthem, giving information out, or in an interview, I think it was with Hong Kong TV, giving the PLA ideas on how to defeat the United States in a war. He's now in the legislature, and he's been asking for, admittedly unclassified, but he's been asking for things like troop movements and other information like that from the Ministry of National Defense. So there's a lot of concern in a lot of quarters, including including some KMT members who think that he's a national security risk. So we talked last week about some of the things he's been saying recently.
Right.
So Johnny Cheng, the new KMT chair, has basically said that these party list legislators can be kicked out of the party if they don't toe the line.
Right. And then they lose their seat.
Right. So he's basically issued a shot across the bow, and he says he's going to speak with him, and that basically he needs to maintain party discipline. So that there's a big question. Will Wu Sz-Huai either shut up or just simply say the party line, or will he keep making these outrageous comments?
Right. It's a good test of Johnny Chang's authority within the KMT, too, to see if he can get Wu Sz-Huai to obey him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. Is right now. So the very first thing that Johnny Chang needs to do now, if he wants to reform the party, is enforce some party discipline.
Right, and crack down on that generation. Will that generation tolerate a crackdown?
That's a very interesting test.
Yep. So, meanwhile, the KMT is also doing something strange with the head of the Center for the Coronavirus Response. What's going on with that?
Do you mean the
TPP?
Chen Shizhong?
Yeah, Chen Shizhong.
Yeah. Well, he's the minister of health, and he's also the head of the command center for the epidemic. And Apollo Chen from the KMT and the TPP have called for him to step down.
The TPP is Ko Wen-je's party, right? The Taiwanese People's Party.
Yeah. And what's wrong with that?
Well, he's got 80% support, and he's doing a great job by both domestic and international standards. Mm-hmm. So it's very strange that the TPP, which is positioning itself as the party of good governance, is now attacking one of the best governed responses in the world for COVID-19. It doesn't make any sense. And it's the kind of thing that will simply marginalize them because he's popular right now and they're doing a great job. And even I know a lot of people who I know support the KMT are saying, whatever you might think of Tsai and the Tsai administration, on this thing, they're doing very well. So, and we've mentioned that in each of the last several shows, just marveling at how well Taiwan is doing. Yeah. So it doesn't seem like a very bright move, especially when you consider all of the other people that the TPP never discusses. I can think of, 3 or 4 county chiefs who are not so clean, legislators, city councilors. I mean, there's just like a list of people that they could be discussing, and lists of policies, the land development policies that seem to favor big business, the Taoyuan airport thing, which is requiring displacement of 9,000 people or something, the extension of the runway. And of course, there's a huge controversy over that because one of the fuel tanks for the airplanes are like 300 meters from the runway. So if a plane screws up its approach, kaboom. Oof. Yeah. So there's been some controversy about this. And these are things that the TPP should be hitting. Here's an obvious weakness. Here's a thing that the public is arguing about. Instead, they're attacking a highly popular minister who's doing a really good job by any objective standard. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And of course, Ko Wen-je, the party chair, is a doctor. So it makes it even more mysterious.
Yeah, it makes it even stranger. He probably knows Chen Shizhong personally.
Probably.
I mean, he's famous, and they've both been in the system for decades.
Chen Shizhong was the Minister of Health during the SARS crisis. So they must know each other. Right.
And so he's experienced. He's been through this before. This is exactly the kind of person that you want to run the show. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make any sense.
What they want is for Su Zhentang, the premier, to take that job over, and then for him, and then Chen Shizhong just to stick to his job as Minister of Health. But I don't really understand the logic there. As you were saying, Chen Shizhong is a medical professional,
right?
Whereas Su Zhentang, I mean, he's doing a pretty good job as premier, but he's not a medical professional.
No, and it's the same situation anyway. There'll be a minister who's wearing 2 hats. So if they're worried about the guy with 2 responsibilities problem, they're not solving it by bringing in Su Zhentang.
Yeah,
it doesn't make any sense.
And you'll notice Johnny Chang, the KMT chair, he's been he's been kind of read between the lines, almost complimentary of the government. For the response. He's talked a bit about, it's important that the KMT support the government right now during the crisis, that kind of thing, and no criticisms.
Yeah, that's actually been, that's points for the KMT there for not turning this into a political crisis.
Yeah.
So, but on the other hand, it's hard for them to say where they could have done better. The response has been so good.
Yeah.
So speaking of responses to COVID-19, how about our friends at the World Health Organization? This week, all over the Taiwan Twitter, I got up and turned on Twitter, and boom, 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 boom. Everyone with smart remarks was retweeting and sending around Facebook that video of the reporter from, what was it, the Hong Kong Free Press?
No, it was RTHK.
That's it, RTHK, who had asked Bruce Aylward, I don't know how to pronounce his name, sadly, who's a deputy director or something over at the WHO, who had personally been to China to look at China's responses. And she'd asked him when Taiwan is going to get in the WHO. And he said, "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. What was the question?" And then she repeats it. And he said, "Well, we've already talked about China. Let's move on."
Yeah. And then he hung up at one point.
Then he hung up. Yeah. So I just, it was so funny to see that on Twitter with everyone condemning it. And basically, and even people who aren't that interested in Taiwan saying, in case you didn't know, the WHO is a wholly owned subsidiary of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. That was pretty funny.
Yeah. And of course, that came on the heels just a few days earlier when the head of the WHO, Tedros, and I can't pronounce his other two names,
Right.
he came out and blamed Taiwan for his woes, basically.
Yeah. That was that was obnoxious of him. Apparently, he mismanaged two previous epidemics when he was when he was a minister back in Ethiopia. He was in the government there. Yeah, so he's not a man with a good track record. And now it's easy to see. Well, we don't even need to talk about it. Everyone's seen it in the news. Him sucking up to China, repeating without any criticism Chinese claims. Saying, what did Aliwood say the other day? That he'd rather be. He'd rather have COVID-19 in China than anywhere else.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah. So you just, it's such a disaster for Taiwan. And, and I'm sure you've seen Taiwan had warned days before China had warned that there was human-human transmission and this was going to be serious. And apparently Taiwanese intelligence had known a couple of weeks before that serious things were going down. Mm-hmm. And did you see the news out just today, just this morning when I opened up Twitter? Lots of prominent people were tweeting. Apparently, investigations have now pieced together that Chinese students and Chinese businesses were shipping masks and hazmat suits and other equipment out of the U.S. in January before China had notified the WHO or anything. Mm-hmm. In other words, they stripped as much as they could out of other countries. Then they declared it was an epidemic, and they left everyone else without supplies. And a couple of smart people on Twitter had noticed this happening, but hadn't put it together completely. But they were saying, hey, we have to start rationing what we send to China because eventually it's going to hit us. But nobody listened, unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, Taiwan notified the WHO of human-to-human transmission on December 31st.
Yep.
And essentially, the PRC didn't confirm that until January 24th. But the WHO didn't take Taiwan's warning, just ignored Taiwan because it came from Taiwan.
Yep. So
that meant that the world had essentially 3 weeks of lead time they could have been preparing because they were listening to the WHO, who were the supposed experts.
Right.
And there was that. There's a big, the last I saw, it was at 580,000. I think it's probably up more by now. There's a petition out there that is calling for Tedros to be replaced and Taiwan to be admitted to the WHO.
Well, we can't do that without getting into the UN first. So
right. But Tedros said that all the criticism, he blamed it on Taiwanese netizens. And then he said, what was his exact phrase? Taiwan wants to join the WHO because of political motivations.
Oh, no.
Mm-hmm. That's a weird...
What else can he say? I mean...
Yeah.
But you know that a friend of mine was pointing out that a lot of the major medical centers in China, the big, modern, well-invested ones, are Taiwanese investments, and they have Taiwanese doctors working there. And so there's already on the front lines of this, the Taiwanese doctors were already noticing human-human transmission, in December at the places where they were working there. And that's why Taiwan got such a long lead time on this.
Taiwan also, I think, sent people to Wuhan in December
to see what was going on.
Yeah, I think they sent some experts, if memory serves.
As I recall, there was a team, but I don't think it was that early. Anyway. So, And meanwhile, over this thing, a bunch of U.S. reporters got kicked out, and this week, Joseph Wu, high-ranking DPP member and a member of the government, invited news outlets. Huh?
Foreign minister.
Yeah, he's the foreign minister. Mm-hmm. Invited news outlets who had been kicked out of the PRC to set up here in Taiwan.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, there's the whole visa and quarantine thing.
Yeah.
So
but he did say that Taiwan would welcome them with open arms and genuine smiles. I think is the way he phrased it.
And long visa applications.
Right. But let's see. It was the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. Was it the New York Times? Was the other one? I think.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. And traditionally these companies have had bureaus either in Beijing or they would set up in Hong Kong. But now neither are particularly free for them, so they may actually relocate here to Taiwan.
That would be awesome.
Taiwan hasn't had any international bureaus really for a long time.
Well, speaking of the world out there, this week also President Trump of the United States signed the Taipei Act, which calls for...
essentially, it encourages the executive branch of the U.S. government to, if it authorizes and encourages the executive branch, like Department of State, et cetera, that if a country essentially acts to undermine Taiwan or Taiwanese sovereignty or to belittle Taiwan or anything like that, which would include, for example, if a country diplomatically recognizes Taiwan and drops it, but it also includes other things, that the U.S. government can take some kind of punitive actions. And there's a variety of things they can do. The act also encourages Taiwan to be included in international organizations that don't require statehood. And also it encourages the U.S. government to deepen ties with Taiwan, essentially economic and other interactions.
Right.
It originally, in the original wording, it called for a free trade agreement with Taiwan, but the House Democrats nixed that.
Right. And we had talked last week about how that thing about organizations that don't require statehood was actually a Clinton era thing that had never been policy before that. So in a way, it's a step backwards.
Yeah.
Yeah. But hey, it's something. And speaking of the U.S., I just like to say a word out there. Can we call this virus COVID-19 and not Wuhan or the Chinese virus? People in the U.S. are getting beaten up and attacked over these terms, and anything that we can do to reduce that, we should do. I've been sparring with people on various sites and places who just don't get this. They think we have to pin this on the CCP. I think the world already knows that the Chinese Communist Party let this thing out, and we don't need to keep calling it the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus, especially since the official nomenclature is COVID-19. So,
yeah. No, I mean, the attacks are just awful. They're absolutely awful.
I just hate seeing that stuff. And I've got 2 half Asian kids, and if they're going to go back to the U.S., this can't be happening.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
good point.
I was, anyway. So Taipei Times called for Tsai Ing-wen to declare a national emergency. And as we saw from your quarantine thing, the police already have the powers that they need. If they can tap your phone without telling you, if they can follow your phone without telling you, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of people don't really realize how heavily surveilled Taiwan is, but if you look on those internet things of heavily surveilled societies, Taiwan is always in black. We're a very heavily surveilled society. And
very.
Yeah. And so the government doesn't need a national emergency to keep track of the few people that it actually has to keep track of. Right now, I think in my own life, because you caused me to reflect on, we actually had a long discussion about this a couple of weeks ago about the foreign community here. And I work in a high school right now. I retired out of the university system and I work at a high school. And a lot of my students have older siblings returning from universities in the US and Canada and the UK, where they would have met up with the virus. And a lot of them are self-quarantined. But the kids at my school weren't. And this is probably true of many other schools as well, where, elite high schools where kids are being prepared to go to college. And one of the things I noted, and, we argued about it, we debated it, but it seemed to me that the foreign population in Taiwan, especially here in Taichung, is composed largely of people who teach in schools. And we are all very closely networked. We go to the same restaurants. And you had pointed out, actually, that foreigners maintain, wider body space, greater distance from each other than Taiwanese do when they talk. Mm-hmm. But we come in contact with each other. And if one of us gets it or a couple of us gets it, it's going to spread very rapidly in the community. We all live in Taichung, the foreigners cluster in a few places. They go to the same restaurants, live in the same neighborhoods. They go to a lot of the same events. It's something that our community has to be really vigilant about.
Yeah. About the emergency decree, the call that the Taipei Times issued for Tsai to use the emergency powers. Now, by the way, there was apparently in this big bill that passed recently with the 60 billion funding, I think it was shoehorned in there. Mm-hmm. It was one of the laws that have recently come out. They actually put in that for disease control that they gave the government sort of wide-ranging powers outside of the normal scope. But I think, and I feel like the government shouldn't use the emergency powers because all that would do is raise alarm.
Right.
And I think that the government's done a really good job of emphasizing that this is a serious situation, but don't panic. And panic isn't going to help. So I think that the government has done a very good job of drawing that fine line between everybody should be concerned and take steps and precautions, but we're not going to impose them. Outside of, shutting major events, and now the nightclubs in Taichung, for example, were ordered shut, whereas the rest of the country did it voluntarily. By and large, Taiwan, unlike right now, huge swathes of the U.S., is not saying to restaurants, you have to close. They're not saying you can't have a wedding, but they're saying we would recommend that you not do the ceremonies right now, have the big parties right now.
Yeah.
So the government has done a lot of this based on advisories and suggestions rather than orders. And most people have been doing a pretty good job, I think. And that's why Taiwan has I think people have been taking it fairly seriously. And I'm looking at, for example, you see all the news coming out of the U.S. where they're shutting everything except for non-essential stuff. Taiwan's not shut down like that.
Right.
But people are vigilant and they're careful.
Yeah. And
I think that they've really taken the right tone, the right balance.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think the Tsai administration, Tsai Ing-wen herself, is not the kind of person who's going to do something really radical like declare a national emergency.
Right.
But I'm worried about whoever follows her with this package of laws, especially if this virus becomes seasonal and we have to face this every year at this time.
Yeah, and until they've got a vaccine, which they're saying would be a year to a year and a half at best from now. So, yeah, I mean, I worry about, I understand why they tracked my cell phone and, why they have these things in place. But I do have some deep concerns about will it be revived for a much less serious situation.
Yes, exactly. And a lot of people have raised this issue. And there's privacy issues and there's all these complicated issues about searches, police entering your apartment, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And even police sweeping you off the street and shoving you back into quarantine. There's some legal issues that people are talking about. And a lot of people are very frightened by the government having this much power over their lives.
Yeah.
And you can't blame them.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I understand why it's in place now. I'm really deeply concerned though, because once police and prosecutors have this sort of power, they're going to want to keep that.
Oh, they never hand that stuff back.
If they can possibly avoid handing it back. And often they'll twist laws. Like, for example, in the United States, the RICO laws were put in place as a way that prosecutors and police could take away ill-gotten gains from gangsters.
Right.
So they couldn't use that money for their own legal defense, which is iffy to begin with.
Yes.
But now the RICO, they'll often use the RICO laws against people who aren't gangs.
Right.
That are not the mafia. It was originally intended specifically for the mafia. And it's kind of gotten out of control.
Yeah. So you can easily see how that could go here. So many, it's very scary. Well, we've been at this now for almost 40 minutes. And I think we should wrap this up.
All right.
All right. Thanks for listening today, folks.
All right. And look forward to us next week. We should be back at our normal time. A quick announcement. It looks like the website will be back up right around April 1st. But maybe not, because that's April Fool's Day. All right. Look forward to next week.
See you around.
This has been brought to you by the Taiwan Report. For more content like this, become our patron at report.tw.
哎，我就是那个台湾狗啦，最喜欢我的台湾狗了。